If you've seen my introduction, I hope it helped you open your mind as we explore the 9/11 controlled demolition theory, as explained by Richard Gage in his video, Blueprint for Truth. Let's try to understand now how a 110-story building with 80,000 tons of structural steel holding it up could have been brought down so quickly on that terrible day. Why a building tells us a lot about how its structure is. Egyptian pharaohs wanted an immortal home. Architects said, okay, boss, several thousand years later, the pyramids still stand. Capitalists are motivated to minimize expense and maximize profit. Fulfill the building code. Make renters feel safe. But the boss mainly wants office space to rent. So the young, innovative engineers and architects design skyscrapers with hundreds of slender, hollow steel support columns around the outside, a strong steel core, but without the usual heavy concrete support. They sprayed on fireproofing to lighten the structure. They built in structural redundancies to hold 3 times the building's static weight, but not 5 times, as Richard Gage asserts, with hat-shaped trusses in the tops of the buildings to shift the loads to other columns at almost the speed of sound in the event of a structural crisis. The towers would be able to withstand major hurricanes and even jet plane crashes. As Time magazine reported in the early 70s, the next generation of skyscrapers could rise higher than ever because of their brilliant lightweight structure. Young architects and structural engineers like Leslie Robertson seemed to defy gravity, soaring to new building heights while creating exciting open-air designs with 72-foot-long trusses, longer than before ever used. As Richard Gage points out in his video, the open floor plan and the long spans depart from the high-rise tradition of a dense grid of steel. Frank DeMartini, quoted in Blueprint for Truth, compared the perimeter structure to the screen on a door, which easily survives being punctured by a pencil. Tragically, he died, I believe, on 9/11, and is unable to offer us his hindsight perspective now that the buildings have collapsed. Many of the steel columns, trusses, and facades were prefabricated and standardized. The buildings were 95% air by volume, 220 acres of floor space in 2 towers, 1 full acre per floor, mostly rentable space. They made them beautiful in a modern way. Alcoa Aluminum still boasts about T, a shiny, lightweight aluminum alloy that was the outside facade of the towers. In 1993, there was a terrorist bombing of the World Trade Center. Inspectors found fireproofing to be deficient. By 9/11, replacement was completed on only 18 floors in Building 1 and on 13 floors in Building 2. The long trusses were designed to maximize open space and were up to 72 feet long. They sat on truss seats and were fastened by 5/8-inch bolts. On 9/11, here's the collapse scenario. Eduardo Casel at MIT writes, the North Tower was hit at 8:46 a.m. above the 96th floor by a Boeing 767 flying at 429 miles per hour. The South Tower was hit at 9:03 above the 80th floor by another 767 flying at 503 miles per hour. Notice the size of the plane relative to the 1-acre building. It's a huge jet covering 60% of the width of the building. It weighs 282,000 pounds, and this one is going over 500 miles per hour. Forensic analyst Jonathan Barnett, who was quoted in Blueprint for Truth but doesn't believe in controlled demolition, said the planes hit the towers banking at 30 and 45 degrees respectively, causing damage to the maximum possible floors, stripping the painted-on fire insulation, and cutting off the water sprinkler pipes. NIST says 43 of 47 core columns were stripped of insulation, plus 60,000 square feet of floor. The plane hitting the South Tower impacted with 50% more energy because of its higher speed. So 30 seconds later, here's a picture. You can see the immediate mechanical damage. F.R. Greening says the vertical collapse safety factor was reduced from 3 to 2 when 60% of the columns on the damaged side were destroyed. The compression wave from the impact visibly damaged the structural integrity of 4 floors below the crash. Shifting the load to the surviving beams created an eccentric load, so the pressures on the remaining structures were now vertical as always and lateral across. Compression waves from the collisions torqued the building. Escapees reported wall cracks and doors jammed shut well below the crash site, evidence of structural weakening. NIST reports that people were knocked down and furniture flew around many floors below the crash. So that is the mechanical damage, and with the fire that the real destruction begins. According to NIST, some of the jet fuel exploded immediately and fires spread to all 4 faces within 15 minutes. Soon smoke is pouring out of the vent from the 109th floor. Suicide leaps occur by the dozens as smoke chokes people on even the top floors. Over 1,000 windows break out as the fire spreads, providing over 12,000 square feet of fire ventilation. Eduardo Clausel said the ensuing fireball set the buildings ablaze in a virtually uncontrollable, fierce fire. The intense fire heated the structural steel elements well beyond the kept thermal limit of 750 degrees, which caused the steel to both lose its stiffness and resistance. Leslie Robertson, the designer of the World Trade Center, was quoted in Blueprint for Truth about the fires, but he also said, with the 707, the fuel load was not considered in the design. There was no fire suppression system that could even begin to deal with that. No designs were prepared for that circumstance. So when the buildings were originally designed to withstand the physical impact of a plane crash, which they did, their model did not include the destructive power of the burning jet fuel itself. Purdue University spent thousands of hours feeding in precise technical specifications to create this 2009 computer simulation of the first second of what the mechanical damage and exploding fire would have looked like in the building. It shows the plane's destructive power and confirms the major findings of the NIST report. 90,850 liters of viscous, dense, blue gunk burning jet fuel created massive conflagrations. NIST says some of that fuel sprayed on the furniture and tens of thousands of filing cabinets and cubicles. Much of the rest coursed down the elevator shafts, heating and softening the vertical core beams, blowing out doors and walls all the way to the basement, exploding on the 77th and 22nd floors of the North Tower and on the West Side lobby, and triggering a fatal fireball in the concourse. The energy of the explosions radiated with equal ferocity forward, backward, left, right, up, down, diagonally, and most of this explosive energy was absorbed by the building itself. What we see outside is actually only one direction of the explosive energy. Let's talk now about the properties of steel itself. It melts at around 2,750 degrees. Colin Bailey says office fires can get up to 2012. Jet fuel burns at 800 to 1,500 degrees. At 1,100 degrees, steel loses 50% of its integrity. The thermal limit of structural steel is 750 degrees. Dr. Alan Fromage says steel girders are bent at 800 to 1,000 degrees to create curved frames for bridges. SteelUniversity.org explains that steel distorts at 572 degrees. At azom.com, they say steel expands in length at temperatures as low as 300 degrees. And it's the fact that steel railroad rails need expansion joints to stop them from buckling, even at 140 degrees on a hot summer day in Arizona. NIST says that the fires reached 1,800 degrees. Thomas Eiger asserts that with limited oxygen, the fire temperature topped out at 1,400. Corus Construction Company's website said the steel is usually only 100 to 200 degrees cooler than the surrounding air. Local hotspots like the far end of the South Tower, where the jet pushed tons of debris into a pile, may have gotten as high as 1,900 degrees. Other places never got over 500 degrees. According to Thomas Eiger, who is quoted in Blueprint for Truth but also opposes the controlled demolition theory, localized hot temperatures weaken some steel, and the temperature differential also helped destroy the structural integrity of the beams. Quote, no normal office fires would fill 4,000 square meters of floor space in seconds. Usually the fire would take up to an hour to spread across the building. This was a very large and very rapidly progressing fire. The smoke was even visible from Earth's orbit. By 10:23 a.m. in World Trade Center 1, the sagging of the steel girders caused the walls to bow windward 55 inches. Here's a diagram from NIST of how a single beam may have sagged. Above the impact zone, the entire building tilted south. Here are two pictures taken about 50 minutes apart. One person called this a utility cable, but NIST calls it a sagging floor. In this simulation, the long support beams are sagging downward to help cause the inward bowing of the outer columns. Random fire damage on all four sides of the building caused irregular stresses everywhere. By the time collapse was imminent, bowing was extreme. Let's talk about some smoke now, because the smoke was billowing up through the top of the building as the fire and smoke spread upwards. Richard Gage says, quote, the fires were diminishing severely, close quote, but in fact they had grown from 3 floors to at least 14 floors in less than an hour. At the critical moment of failure, 3 outside walls were nearing capacity. The core, on the other hand, had compressed, and the hat truss that connected the perimeter walls to the core was partially suspending the core. The weak south wall buckled first and was momentarily supported by the hat truss, which buckled in the center first, causing the antenna drop seen by FEMA and others. As the building began its collapse, air pressure pushed the smoke upward and out the sides. Richard called this, quote, evidence of explosions on the top of Building 1. But if there had been 4,500-degree explosive nanothermites at the very top of the building, then no one could have walked on the debris right after the collapse. In addition, a classic controlled demolition, no smoke comes out the top. People in the upper floors were severely suffering from smoke inhalation because hot smoke rises. Look at the movement of the smoke in absolute terms rather than relative to the falling towers, and you'll see that the smoke and the dust left behind by the collapses had no significant upward velocity. Or as one scientist put it, he actually said smoke rises and he uses that as proof of controlled demolition. Another, I wonder if Richard is trying to say they took the towers down using demolition charges on the roof. By the way, the building that had twice as much weight above the crash site collapsed twice as quickly, not surprising in a natural collapse scenario. NIST said that at 10:20 a.m., the police aviation unit reported that, quote, the top of the tower might be leaning, and a minute later reported that the North Tower is buckling on the southwest corner and leaning to the south. At 10:28 a.m., they reported that the roof is going to come down very shortly. The North Tower collapsed at 10:28 a.m. The South Tower was hit at 9:03 a.m., causing the building to sway 27 inches back and forth. The off-center impact twisted the upper part counterclockwise. 9/11 calls reported falling ceiling tiles, collapsed walls, jet fuel smells. The top section tilted toward the face that had buckled. It fell at least one story in free fall and impacted the lower sections with a force equivalent to over 30 times its own weight. This was sufficient to buckle the columns of the story immediately below it. The block then fell freely through the distance of another story. Gage reported that firefighters witnessed sounds and flashes of explosions, orange and red flashes all around the building, which is true. At the onset of both collapses, 1/2 cubic feet of air per floor was being pushed down onto the fires, creating a monumental bellows effect, literally stoking the fires and quickly creating a massive ring of fire around the perimeter of the collapse zone. That is a much more plausible explanation for the fire's sudden growth. If it were from controlled demolition, similar rings of fire would have been visible on dozens of other floors during the collapse, and they were not. NIST says no building in the United States has ever been subjected to the massive structural damage and concurrent multi-floor fires that the towers experienced on September 11th. NIST predicted many breaks in the support columns as the weaker welded connections broke, but many randomly damaged steel supports were much smaller, or bigger, like this 13-story high facade, which would have been pulverized by a controlled demolition. There has not been a single published peer-reviewed paper disputing the fundamentals of this collapse theory. On the other hand, there have been several published results in general support of the collapse hypothesis. This is part of the reason why NIST did not consider the entire duration of the collapse. Early results from engineers and scientists indicated that once the upper stories began to fall, the complete collapse of the structure was not in doubt, and there was no credible result to the contrary. And we now have an example from 2008 of a tall, steel-framed building which collapsed very fast and almost symmetrically, and I will be showing that video in a later chapter of this rebuttal. The National Institute of Standards and Technology has determined the causes and made recommendations for new fire and building code standards. The National Fire Protection Association and the International Code Council both took NIST recommendations and redesigned their templates for building and fire codes. And unlike Richard Gage, I believe those revisions will save lives. The natural collapse scenario compiled from my research with NIST, as well as a host of other scientific sources, is the theory that is accepted by the vast majority of scientists around the world. We've already seen 44 reasons supporting natural collapse. In the next section of Blueprint for Truth, Respectfully Rebutted, we will examine some of Richard Gage's objections to the natural collapse theory. Thank you.